One of the joys of being able to be seen on the screen is that I can't read the chat. Emily is being our mission controller.
Sure, I don't think you all had a chance to answer Josh Wallace's question. I'm curious how qualitative research and lived theology might navigate the borderlands of ethnographic work and presentations of grounded theologies and constructive theological work.
Who wants to field that?
Knut, could you hear that?
Sorry, I didn't hear it very well. I'm not sure if I understood it either, to be honest, but please try again.
So I think what Emily will do is read through put it back into the chat.
I'll put it back in the chat.
Okay, good.
Knut, just check the newest chat.
Okay, good.
Rephrase that question right there. I'll take a quick stab at it because it certainly was. I just finished my dissertation a year ago, so it's all fresh in my head, and struggling with the same thing about how do you move toward the constructive theology when you are working with descriptive work. The key is intellectual humility. I mean, you just can't make any grandiose statements about God, but you need to make some statements about God. And the way that I did it was I tried to look, this is where you do look at sort of written systematic theologies. I did my study on Chinese Christianity, Chinese Christians. And so what I did was I went back and looked at the Chinese theologians who have written theologies. And but I not only looked at their theologies and what they wrote, I also looked at the way that they lived. And I tried to correspond, what did you write in relation to what was going on in your life at that moment? And so I tried to look at the lived theology of theologians, not their written theologies, and then put that in dialogue with the grounded experiences of my participants. So to say something about God that resonated with those written theologies as well. And I don't know if that's helpful, but that's just what I did to skirt around this question.
I mean, the one thing I'd add before we go to Knut or Rachel is it is not the case that the empirical work is description and the theology is construction. Actually, if you have theologically oriented research questions, you're engaged in theological construction from the get-go. And there's an eminent sociologist who was in dialogue with an eminent theologian. She said to me, if he says that my work is descriptive one more time, I'm going to punch him. And that's a sociologist recognizing that the theologians misunderstanding what's going on. And we shouldn't inscribe that into our projects. Knut?
Well, I think what all of us three have in common is that we think that theology is constructed not in the university, but basically anywhere and everywhere. And it is constructed in the same motion as we understand it or analyze it or observe it. So it's one and the same move. And I think there are differences between, let's say, developed academic theology and lived theology. There's a difference in precision, and there's a decision in how developed the terms are. And by that you can say there's a difference in quality. But I think at some point all theology has been empirical or lived. Any revelation of God has at one point been lived in the incarnation, if anything else. I mean, so this thought that knowledge of God has to be outside of empirical reality in order to be of high quality, I don't agree with that. So I think that might be one thing that we have in common, actually. And one could easily ask back to academic theology. One of the examples I give in the chapter from my own research is the finding of of what me and my colleague called a theological wiggle room, as in very essential for theological practice. People need to have some wiggle room in their theologizing, in the lived, but that's not a skill we learn in academia. And I would say that's a weakness with academic theology, that we pretend that stuff like wiggle room and imprecision is important. I mean, it can be immensely important, and we should incorporate that into academic theology.
Easton, there's two questions. I think you can probably see them both up there
Oh, great.
better.
Yeah, well, a lot of those Chinese theologians studied in so two of the ones I looked at were at Union. Union has a long history with Chinese theologians, but also people like Watchman Nee, who reacted against sort of some of that modernizing. But what's interesting is their life story, they were all living the same experience of modern China's messiness, you know, and they responded to it in different ways, which is interesting with their theologies.
There's another one about trickle down and Western academic right there too.
Yeah, it's the idea of raising the profile. Trickle down model that will still assume.
Yeah, I really do want to change that to change. I just sort of am a realist in the saying that it's still currently that way. Unfortunately, you know, people from the global South, if you know, they want to get into the top schools of theology in the West, and my hope is that when they get there, they hear like, actually, we want to learn from you. I'm going to give you the tools. You go back and do your thing, and then I'll learn from you. That's one way to flip that script, because I think realistically it's still the script at the moment. So.
Cool. Do you have anything to add, Asha?
Yes, I was listening to the talk or the distinction between descriptive and constructive. I think in that question, if we're thinking about doctoral students and how we write, one of the questions that, as I was reflecting on this, the wider project for doctoral work is, how do we write ourselves into our work? And how do you advise doctoral students, how do they write themselves into their work? And so, I mean, that's the question that I have here, the relationship between you and your community that you are working with, especially if you find yourself as a participant in said community, and if you come from a historically unlistened to population in the first place. How do you write yourself in? And how do you balance all the voices, and what's the relationship like? And I think that's part of the work, as I think about now in the position of having to work with doctoral students, you know, how do you advise that work? And that's kind of where, so when I hear questions like that, that's also what I think about, which is realizing that, no, we are theological in our work, and well, I would claim myself to be as such. And so I write as a theologian, among other theologians, right? All the women I work with in the prison, among other theologians.
Yeah.
And so I'm writing my story intermingled with their stories. But I think that's something that we aren't practiced in.
I would affirm that and just say, you know, we need to claim the theologian title, and as opposed to skirting around. Am I really doing theology or not? That can occupy a lot of time that is unnecessary for these kinds of projects. Just say, you are a theologian because you care about what God is doing, and that's why you're doing the work, right?
Right.
I mean, there's a history of colonialism that's linked to anthropology. And are we in danger of simply going through all of that again? Or what is the danger of us going through that again as theologians without learning the lessons that are being spoken about? How do we address that concern?
Well, if I can pick back up on John's spiritual practices words, but when we talk about love in context of relationships, and then thinking about the end, what are the ends of the research? What's it for, right? If the research is for my book project, right? Then I mean, that maybe I have a higher tendency of falling into these scripts that we don't want to fall into. But if my research is for some alleviation of some concern or the betterment of some condition that we as in the community find ourselves in, then I think we have less likelihood of or we have a greater chance of maybe being able to work out those. But there's always power dynamics and power differentials, always, even in our best efforts. I think about our work in the prison. To do focus groups, those aren't natural. No one does focus groups. We just don't do that. No one sits around and says, can you write out your life history in chapters? Like, these are not natural practices. So we are already going in with unnatural practices to learn more. But the students loved it. Like they really enjoyed getting to listen to each other and to learn about each other in different ways. And that for us was a part of the goal, right? Is we wanted to create something, a different environment, even if we could only do it for an hour at a time. So the goals weren't just at the end, right? But it's all along the way, trying to create goals to alleviate some sense of not being heard, not being listened to, not being validated in that space. And so, yeah, so we tried that. And reflexivity, someone just put it in the chat. Yeah, so I mean, we were attended to those, acknowledging those, and always realizing, I think intellectual humility came up before, always realizing that we are always stepping. I mean, every time we step, like our footprint, you know, makes a change in the sand, right? It's like, we've been there. Our presence have been there, but their presence has also been with us. But yeah, I don't ignore, or I don't not acknowledge the way that power dynamics have worked in the past. I'm just looking at the colonial dynamics there, and what Liz Bounds was saying, who's the one I was mentioning. Yeah, it requires constant attention and a little bit of regret. Honestly, I find myself a little like,
Yes.
You know, going into the research, feeling weird about the research because I do have a relationship with the community, but wanting to do better in this place, wanting to develop better practices for the community, and then wondering if you're doing enough. That's where I left, wondering if I've done enough. I don't know if there's a way around that.
I think for me, the challenge of lived theology, and I'm sure Knut is looking at this as well, is the challenge to listen well. And so when I was doing my research, it's easy to have some kind of preset theological agenda, but if I really want to listen well, I think, you know, I drew this from some Natalie Wake-Stevens work, and also an exemplar to me of what lived theology in a world Christian context would be Todd Whitmore's Imitating Christ in Magui. I highly recommend that book. But because they are struggling with this question, all the emotions you just expressed, they express as well within their projects. And for me, I have those same feelings. But at the end, this question is, I just tell myself, I am not constructing a theology on my own. I should be co-constructing. And when I did my interviews, in the later ends, you know, when I had stronger relationships, you know, I was explicit, you know, you're a Christian, I'm a Christian. So when we do this interview, you know, the goal of this is not for me to just extract something, but we're working out what we think God is doing, you know. And there was definitely this sense of like, when I ask you questions, you're thinking about things you don't normally think about, like the interview process as something that is changing them. When I ask them questions about their lives, you can see the gears turning and them rethinking what happened in their lives because they were asked a question. And I think there's theologizing happening there between both the researcher and the participant. And so for me, it needs to be co-constructive. And I think that keeps me humble. Like, obviously, I can't theologize without participants, the communities that we're working with.
I mean, there's another side to that. I remember being in an AAR session, and forgive me, I can't remember. If anybody remembers the person's name, please put it on the chat. There was somebody, we were talking along these ways, empathy and all this sort of thing, and the person was a sociologist who worked on sexual violence in South Africa, to which she said, I'm not neutral. I'm not valuing the, I want to change this thing that's going on. Or Angela Krause, who, again, probably at the AAR or one of these other meetings, was asked to define ethnography. She said, well, ethnography is finding out who's stolen what from whom and finding a way to give it back to them. Yeah. So this, there's an activist voice, which, if we're all kind of, we're worried about a position, about an ethics, about a politics in this. There's this other, well, you've expressed it with your pedagogy. It's Elizabeth Phillips's work on Zionist Christianity in the United States, a community that she fundamentally disagreed with, that she was researching. This is the other side, the flip side of this issue about, which we shouldn't lose, I don't think.
You talk about how you engaged with your participants afterwards. Did they read what you were writing? Have they been able to comment back on it? Maybe the three of you and Kurt.
I'll repeat that. Emily asked from behind her mask, could you talk about how you fed back to your participants? Who'd like to go first there? Knut, you haven't spoken for a while.
Yeah, absolutely. And the biggest compliment, I think, is when they read your article or book or what you present the research, when they come up to you and say stuff like, well, not only do we think that we're properly taken care of, this is what we said, but actually now we understand more of who we are and we agree with that. The kind of extra level or layer of understanding that sometimes comes through proper analysis. So it's not only, I think, to listen and to be involved in the field, but there's also this humbleness or taking the time to actually let your analytical face be long enough, so that your analysis also can be faithful to your informants in a way. Yeah. Can I add another thing that connects to what was said here previously? I think that we have a proper problem, everyone that's involved in theology and qualitative research, when it comes to generalizability. And it connects, of course, to qualitative research, but it also connects to lived theology. And I would really like to, and what we talk about now, no one in the book has written about this, as far as I know, but someone really should, or maybe in the next book, because you can, let's say let me use child theology as an example. Comes from understanding children and how children believe and theologize. But then what has happened, for instance, in my home country, is that people who are, what do you call, they strongly believe child theology. They have now become people in power. So basically, child theology is opposed on the church from above by adults. And that, I mean, what happens when lived theology becomes theory, and not only theory, but theory in power and theory in political power? When does lived theology stop in that process of generalizability? When we talk easily about post-colonial theory, has that stopped being lived theology then? Or do we need to once again get back on the ground, get back on the ground, get back on the ground? That's what I'm asking. Yeah, would be interesting to hear what the two other people have to say about this.
Yeah, Knut, I really like your just the get back at the ground, get back on the ground, because I think that is one, it means that our work is inexhaustible. So there will always be work for us to do in that sense. But well, I don't know about how, you know, different people will write differently, but that is part of the challenge of generalizability. I know when I talk about the work that I do within the prison, I talk about it as within this prison. This is what is coming out of this prison, and here are the conditions that are structuring this environment, right? Now you start shifting those conditions, things may not work out the exact same way, right? So, but does that mean that there aren't some generalizable pieces that might come out of our work? Yes, but I don't think we can take it as a whole. I want to go back quickly to the faithful to your informants piece that was talked about, and that you mentioned. And I want to put it in conversation with the topic about doctoral students, research and preparation. What would it mean if that was a part of your assessment? Not just your committee, but the community, the congregation, the whoever else it was, right? They are also a part of your, I mean, really, if we want these to become more ingrained in practice, then we'll start building it out, right? And I know from my work with the women inside, even now I'm still in the what do you call it, the kind of the analytical phase of hoping to get back in, but we have a whole other issues with COVID and all of that. But there are times when our research makes it difficult to go back, difficult to do the exchange. And so questions become raised about, well, who is the audience of the work? What does it mean to be faithful to your informants versus accountable? Can I be faithful to them if I am writing something that will make better educators, better chaplains, better ministers who will then go in and work with their population? Is that a part of being faithful to our informants? So, I mean, I think our conversation is making me think about the levels of relationships that are involved and who we write to, and whose practices are we trying to enhance, change, improve. And sometimes it's not necessarily the practices of the community, but the wisdom of the community that might inform our practices for those of us who are, you know, in these sorts of professions that are working with these communities. And so, yeah, I mean, those are the questions that have been raised for me as I think about my own work, particularly with the population that's really difficult to stay in contact with in the way I would like to, right? I mean, I think there are ways, but it's difficult. And I don't always expect that they want to read all of my stuff either. I don't make that a requirement.
Yeah, that is it. Were you going to say something?
I resonate very much with both what Knut and Michelle said. And in fact, one of the perks of, I did my dissertation defense online over Zoom, since I just did it last year. One of the perks of that, however, was you could invite anybody from anywhere in the world. So what I actually did do was I invited some of my participants, the ones that I had, you know, did a long series of interviews with. I didn't tell my committee, so They might have just been like, who are these random Chinese people at on the Zoom link? But that was my way of keeping myself accountable in a very realistic sense. Like I am actually presenting my dissertation. They'll be there. You know, they were watching on Zoom, and sort of my hope is to continue to have conversation with them about the theology that I felt like I saw in their lives, right, and have them correct me, and that's part of the second phase, I guess. And going back to China is hard too. So I feel you.
There's 3 questions right here. You can see all 3 if anybody wants to take any of those 3 that are up there.
Eileen Campbell-Reid, if only she were here to answer that question. Wouldn't that be nice?
Oh, beautiful.
See Eileen Campbell-Reid's chapter in Conundrums on power and the danger. Well, perhaps when you speak in the next session, you can pick that up, Eileen.
I'll do my best.
She said she'll do her best.
Yeah, what Liz Bounds is talking about there, some of the political implications of working with different populations. To do research in the prison, we had to get approval from the warden and the Department of Corrections. And there's all sorts of ethical complications about what we say, what we don't say, how do I protect the anonymity of the students. Yeah, so there are a lot of additional challenges to keep in mind, but
Easy answers.
there's no easy answer. I mean, but there's always the risk of our commitment is to tell the truth. My commitment is to tell the truth. How do I tell the truth and not harm?
I mean, I think one of the things within the British system, you have supervisors and then you have 2 people who are examiners. It's a little bit similar in the Norwegian system where you have supervisors and then you have people who are a committee that examine that weren't involved in the supervising of the project. And I think these issues of representation, power, whether people have adequately circled back to their participants, those of us who begin to get involved in the examining process, one way to help develop a field is for examiners to expect students to have done that. To sort of, just like if we would expect a little bit of a nod in the direction of IRB or ethics, not in a way that's boring, but to show that you've been through it. To begin to sort of say, well, I'm uncomfortable with this project if you haven't done this. And you can push it back in the British system, you can push it back to the student to say, I really would like you to include this as a correction. And if we start to do that kind of thing as examiners and those who are on advisory committees and so on, slowly we'll progress good practice in the field, I think. It's a collective learning that we're in on all of this, which is important.
Canute?
Yeah, there's a question here from Jeremy Chen about what if academia was more situated within communities of practice. Well, it's now been 5-6 years since I did my PhD, and my experience is that in the years you write your PhD, that is you're on your own a bit. There's an element of a ticket to play thing as you do your PhD. But my experience is also that after having done my PhD, almost all my research has been collaborative and in a community and very much more communal. And I think this conversation we're having now, as Pete started with introducing the whole day, he mentioned this, that the friendly environment and the way people find each other also around research. I think this research we're doing here is very much situated in communities of practice. Yeah, so there's a glimmer of hope, at least for PhD students stuck in your loneliness. Yeah.
I wanted to pick up on the question there from Jennifer Luke, who talks about, and Pete just talked about how we check our analysis or interpretation with the participants. I just want to name something. That is a very intimidating process. And I think that's what keeps a lot of people from doing it, because you have to open yourself up to the risk that you didn't listen well, or you heard something wrong, or they don't like what you wrote about it. I mean, it's the most vulnerable you can be, is to take what you've just spent all this time with and to put it back down and say, so is this right? Did I hear you right? What do you feel about this? And I don't even know if this right, is this right? That's actually not the right question, right? So thinking about what questions we would ask, but it's very vulnerable on both sides. Because it could be that maybe you did adequately capture what you heard, and that is not how that person wants to see themselves, right? So there are other dynamics, right, that are going on. So if I think about skills and practices that we might develop, that would be one. What do we do? What does that look like? What does that process need to look like for us to become more comfortable with that work? I mean, thinking about our earlier sessions about the different skill sets that we develop, these are the skills that we develop, a way of now having to receive and be in a position of humbly have to get critique. Although I would say, as academics, we put ourselves we're open for critique all the time, every time we publish something. So I don't know why we get, we act like we can't take it from the our research subjects. But this is just the world that we have entered ourselves into. And so our first set of critique might be coming from the people that we are writing with, for, and about.
I mean, there's another sense in which owning the fact that you are a researcher producing knowledge and is an important thing to say, I think. You are creating something. You're trying to create meaning from a complex lived environment. And that's your task. You know, you could be a poet or a songwriter or a preacher, but you're an academic writing something as a result of something that you've done. And that's your contribution. You are there is a place for virtuosity, I think, in all of this. The problem comes when virtuosity doesn't come with humility or responsibility. Those are the things, the power imbalance. But nevertheless, somebody that can look at something and say something out of it that perhaps other people haven't quite got to yet. Otherwise, what's the point of doing the research unless you can say something new that other people didn't know?
And on this question of, this ties together the accountability question, or response to your participants and interlocutors, as well as the generalization question is something I was thinking about, especially when it comes to theology, right? Theology is, what is it but a general statement about the world and creation and God. For me, the humble position that I've tried to foster, and I hope to take forward in conversations with my informants ahead, is this idea of just resonance, that you propose the theology of this context, grounded in this context, but you also say other people in similar contexts might resonate with this in certain ways. And if you do, in what ways does it resonate positively? Because then there's a link there. But of course, your context is different. There's other parts that don't resonate. And so this process of weaving together the generalizations from different contexts, I think for me, the concept of resonance has been very important. As I've talked about my study and taking a place in, in the context of modern China and its sort of rapid changes. But then people in the States feel some of those things that Chinese people are feeling as well. And so letting those resonances begin to set the table.
Rochelle, Becky's asked you a question up there.
Yeah, so I was thinking, Becky, about what I would go back and say to the students that I work with. And I think I would say, or even when we were setting up the project, I would say what I was hoping that this project was going to do, right? From the beginning, like I really want our practices of theological education to be better, right? We're not the only people coming in doing these sorts of programs. All sorts of ministers and chaplains and faith leaders come into prisons all the time. What is it that we might need to know about your hopes for life, the obstacles that you have for life, but then how you make a life for yourself in here that might inform our work? And so I'd go back and say, this is what I heard from you, and this is what it inspired me to say to them. What do you think about this? What did I think? Is there anything else? Did I miss something? Did I misinterpret something here? To you, right? Did I misinterpret how you made sense of this experience? If I'm describing something, but yeah, in the terms of this is how this inspired me to make an intervention here. I mean, I have to own that part, right? But I'd love to know if they felt that that was a faithful interpretation or a faithful use of their work. I also have to open myself up for them to say, and what does this have to do with me? Right, back to the, and then I have to go back and say, right, this needs to be more directly, it has to come back more direct than this, right? So, I mean, that's the back and the forth, that's the commitment to the community that is there. But I think I think we owe it to folks. What is it that we're doing? Like, why am I asking you these questions? For you, but also, what do I hope to do for the wider work? What's the goal of this? What am I hoping for? And trusting people with that. They would often say, they're like, I know you're a PhD student. We want to help you get your dissertation. That's what they do. We want to help you get your dissertation. I'm like, well, thank you, but that's I'm like, I know, right? I'm like, I know you want to help me get my dissertation. I said, but is this project there's a larger goal than a dissertation.
I promised that we would circle back to you, Rochelle, to be able to say something about your chapter for the people watching this on the Ecclesiology and Ethnography website. Do you want to just rehash briefly what you were saying earlier?
Yes, I'll succinctly say, so my chapter is focused on ethnography as critical pedagogy. And so ultimately what I'm doing in the chapter is just arguing that there is no critical liberative pedagogy without ethnographic commitment to deep listening. And someone in the chat said deep theological listening, which I do like that as a theological practice. Disciplined observation, dialogue, and the co-construction of knowledge with our intent on identifying and diminishing, dismantling where possible, oppressive and unjust systems and the creation of more life-affirming ones. And so that's what, if we think about our research, right, in the realm of a teaching and learning process, it becomes a deeply collaborative effort between those of us who are facilitating the work and the community at large. And I make the argument in the essay to say that we are modeling a certain way of asking questions about the world, attending to our lives, making meaning of them in the practice of research. So there is a pedagogy to that, there's an educational value to that. And if we are mindful of that, we might be able to be more intentional about what we're doing, how we're doing it, and to what end that we're doing it. And then in the article, I talk about my work within the prison, asking our students in our program, what life do you want for yourself? What is a good life? What is possible here? What are the obstacles? How do we work around them? And then letting that open up into conversations. They would end up in the classroom, right? They would end up in the hallways, these conversations, and giving us curriculum, goals, discussion points, things to work towards together, to make our practice of, we say, doing and creating theology together more life affirming in that space. And so the article encourages us to think about ethnography and qualitative research as a way of making teachers and learners and researchers out of all of us, not just the one primary researcher.
Amen.
So Bjorn asked a question.
Yeah, I tried to bring it back up, but the chat's moving too quickly. So could you please go back and expand a little more about the difference between the descriptive, interpretive, and normative task of theology versus the blurring of these tasks?
So Knut, you probably will understand Bjorn's context as a fellow.
Yeah.
Do you want to briefly address that question for us?
Well, I think you need to be clear, especially in your writing, of and give the impression that you do one thing at the time. First you do this, then you do this, then you do that. And I think that goes with scholarly writing. But at the same time, there's this acknowledgement that these things go together simultaneously and all the time. And it's impossible to pinpoint where interpretation starts and where interpretation stops, where normativity starts and where normativity stops. And I think it adds to research quality if you are transparent about that. For instance, if you go into a field with an agenda, theoretical or activistic or any agenda at all, even Christian, transparency is always good, I think. I don't know if that is clarifying, but we can continue the talk some other time, Bjorn, if you want. Please stay in touch.
So Elizabeth says, yes, at Eileen Campbell-Reid. Well, no one could disagree with that, could they, Eileen?
Oh, yeah, sure. We all the time.
Eileen says people can disagree with her. So I think we'll draw this to a close. Thank you, everyone, for your brilliant questions and engaging with this. But particularly, thank you very much, Knut, Rachel, and Easton for sharing the work that you're doing and being involved in this project and answering people's questions. We recommence at 2, so we have an hour's grace. During that period, you can go back to the coffee hour. We will open that room for people who want to have discussing groups. But we will be opening the other link at 2 o'clock for the final session, when we have, well, the much vaunted and requested yes at Eileen Campbell-Reid, and Glenn Packiam, and from Duke University, Luke Bretherton. And we're very much looking forward to that session to close us out at the end of the day here in New York, and some of you, your day might end rather sooner. But thank you very much, everyone, for joining us, and we'll see you either in the group chat or at 2 o'clock. Thank you.
Just a quick note, the lunch link That'll open in about 15 minutes, just so people can go get their food or whatnot. So if you log on, there's nothing going on there. At the lunch social link, Zoom room will open in about 10 to 15 minutes.
Good idea, Easton.
I need to go.
Thanks, Kadu.
We all do. Thanks, bye.